The United States has the largest economy on Earth, and yet the signs of a slow financial unraveling have appeared before in nations that once said the same thing. History does not announce its turning points. It whispers them through debt charts, currency shifts, and the quiet decisions made in marble buildings far from public view. Welcome to the Market Antiquarian, where history and finance reveal how the world really works. Subscribe to stay informed. There is a pattern buried inside the collapse of every great economic power. It moves through 7 distinct stages, and it has never once skipped a single step. The Roman Empire did not fall in a day. The Spanish Empire did not crumble overnight. The British pound did not lose its grip on global trade in a single season. Each of those collapses followed the same slow rhythm, the same gathering pressure, the same moments where leaders chose comfort over correction. What makes this pattern dangerous is not how fast it moves. What makes it dangerous is how invisible it remains until it is already too late to turn back. Economists at the Bank for International Settlements identified this rhythm across 28 historical debt cycles, spanning the last 200 years of recorded financial history. Stage 1 begins not with crisis, but with confidence. A nation produces more than it spends, its currency is trusted, and the world lends it money willingly and cheaply. The United States reached this stage of peak confidence in the years following World War II, when American factories produced nearly half of all global industrial output. Gold sat stacked inside Fort Knox in Kentucky. The dollar was legally tied to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other major currency answered to the dollar. Washington, D.C. signed the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, and with that single document, the United States became the financial center of the entire post-war world. Foreign governments lined up to hold American dollars as their reserve currency. Holding dollars was the same as holding gold, and the world believed that completely. This is where Stage 1 always plants its first dangerous seed. Confidence becomes so total that spending discipline begins to quietly soften at the edges. Stage 2 begins when spending starts to outpace what the nation actually earns. The government borrows to fund what taxes can no longer fully cover on their own. The United States crossed this line in the 1960s, when President Lyndon Johnson simultaneously funded the Vietnam War and launched his Great Society domestic programs. The Federal Reserve Building in Washington, D.C. saw its balance sheet stretch as the government printed more dollars than the gold stored in Fort Knox could back. France noticed first. President Charles de Gaulle sent French warships to New York Harbor to physically collect gold in exchange for the dollars France had been holding. Gold bars moved from the vaults of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York onto French ships, and that single image told the world something was quietly breaking. Other nations followed. West Germany, Switzerland, and several South American governments began converting their dollar reserves back into gold at accelerating rates. The gold window, as economists called it, was draining. The United States was losing physical gold faster than it could maintain the credibility of the Bretton Woods system. Stage 2 is always marked by this exact tension. The nation still looks strong from the outside, but the internal arithmetic has already stopped adding up correctly. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon sat before a television camera and told the American people the dollar would no longer be convertible into gold. In a single Sunday evening broadcast, the financial architecture that had governed global trade for 27 years was dismantled without a vote, without a treaty, without warning. The next morning, currency traders in London, Tokyo, and Frankfurt stared at their screens in silence. The rules they had built entire careers around had simply vanished. This was the transition from Stage 2 into Stage 3. The nation, freed from the discipline of gold, now had the ability to create money with almost no hard limit. Stage 3 is defined by what economists call monetary expansion. The printing press, or its modern equivalent, becomes a tool of first resort rather than last resort. Between 1971 and 1988, the United States money supply grew at rates that had never been seen in peacetime American financial history up to that point in time. Inflation climbed from 3% in 1972 to over 14% by 1980. The price of a grocery basket, a tank of gasoline, a home mortgage, all doubled within a decade. Workers in Detroit automobile factories watched their wages rise on paper, but found that each paycheck bought visibly less than the paycheck from the year before it. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker walked into the Marble Building on Constitution Avenue in Washington and made a decision that caused immediate and widespread economic pain. Volcker raised interest rates to 20%. Mortgage offices across the country went dark. Car dealerships in Michigan stood empty. Construction cranes stopped moving across American cities. The recession that followed was brutal, but it stopped the inflation spiral. It also created a new pattern of behavior inside Wall Street that would matter decades later. Investors learned that the Federal Reserve would intervene aggressively to manage economic pain. This created an expectation that would quietly distort risk-taking for the next 40 years. Stage 3 leaves a residue. When money has been expanded and then contracted sharply, the institutions that survived begin to reach for yield in ways they never did before. Banks on Wall Street began engineering new financial instruments in the 1980s that allowed risk to be packaged, sliced, renamed, and sold to investors who did not fully understand them. Mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, and credit default swaps became the invisible architecture beneath the American financial system. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, Stage 4 arrives when financial complexity begins to outpace the regulatory framework designed to oversee it. The system grows faster than the rules meant to govern it. In 1999, the United States Congress repealed the Glass-Steagall Act, a law that had separated commercial banking from investment banking since the Great Depression of the 1930s. With that barrier removed, the largest banks in New York City could now place speculative investment bets using the same deposits that ordinary Americans kept in their checking accounts. Citibank, J.P. Morgan, and Bank of America grew into institutions so large and so deeply connected to the broader economy that their failure would become unthinkable by design. The phrase, "too big to fail," entered the American financial vocabulary not as a warning, but as a statement of structural fact inside the corridors of Washington and Wall Street. Between 2000 and 2007, home prices in cities like Miami, Las Vegas, Phoenix, and Los Angeles rose so fast that the gains themselves became the primary driver of consumer confidence. Families in suburban neighborhoods across the country refinanced their homes and spent the extracted equity on cars, vacations, and renovations, treating their houses as personal bank vaults. Mortgage brokers in glass-fronted offices across California and Florida signed loans for borrowers with no income verification, no down payment, and no realistic path to repayment over time. Rating agencies in New York assigned the highest possible safety grades to financial products that contained thousands of these unstable mortgages bundled together inside complex structured instruments. Stage 4 always involves this specific failure. The people whose job it is to identify danger have a financial incentive to look the other way at exactly the wrong moment. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers Bank in New York City filed for bankruptcy. It was the largest corporate bankruptcy in United States history at that moment in time. The next morning, credit markets across the world froze. Banks refused to lend to other banks. The machinery that moves money through the global economy ground to a visible halt. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson stood before cameras in Washington and told the American public that the entire financial system was days away from complete and total functional breakdown. Congress passed the Troubled Asset Relief Program, known as the bank bailout. The United States government purchased toxic financial assets from the largest banks using public money. $700 billion in taxpayer funds entered Wall Street institutions to prevent the kind of cascading collapse that had turned the 1929 stock market crash into a decade-long depression. Stage 5 begins here. This is the stage where the cost of preventing collapse is added directly onto the national debt, and the cycle of borrowing accelerates past the point of easy return. The United States national debt stood at approximately $10 trillion when the 2008 financial crisis began. Within 4 years, it had risen past $16 trillion in verified government accounting. The Federal Reserve dropped interest rates to near zero and began a program called quantitative easing, buying government bonds and mortgage securities with newly created electronic money. Between 2008 and 2014, the Federal Reserve balance sheet expanded from approximately $900 billion to over $4 trillion, an increase that had no historical precedent in peacetime. Asset prices rose. Stock markets in New York recovered sharply. Real estate prices in coastal cities climbed back above their previous peaks and then continued rising beyond them. But the recovery was not evenly distributed. The top 10% of American households owned approximately 84% of all stocks. So the stock market recovery primarily enriched those who already held assets. Workers in manufacturing towns in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan saw factory jobs continue to disappear as companies automated production lines or moved operations to lower-cost countries overseas. The gap between the financial economy, meaning the world of stocks, bonds, and real estate, and the real economy, meaning wages, jobs, and local businesses, grew measurably wider each year. Stage 5 is defined by this widening gap. The numbers at the top of the economy look healthy. The numbers at the bottom of the economy tell a completely different story. By 2019, the United States national debt had passed $22 trillion. Interest payments alone on that debt consumed more than $375 billion of the federal budget every single year. Then, a global health crisis arrived in early 2020. Governments around the world shut down economies to slow the spread of a virus that had originated in Wuhan, China. The United States Congress passed spending packages totaling over $5 trillion in emergency relief within a span of approximately 18 months to support businesses, workers, and state governments. The Federal Reserve once again expanded its balance sheet, this time past $8 trillion. Money moved into the economy faster than the supply of goods could keep pace. By mid-2021, inflation had returned. The price of used cars, lumber, groceries, gasoline, and rent all climbed simultaneously across American cities and rural communities in ways not seen since the 1970s. Stage 6 is where history becomes a mirror. The conditions that defined the 1970s inflation crisis were reappearing: high debt, expanded money supply chain disruption, and rising consumer prices. The Federal Reserve began raising interest rates aggressively in 2022, the fastest rate increase cycle since Paul Volcker stood in that Washington building 4 decades earlier and chose financial pain over inflation. By 2023, the federal funds rate had climbed from near zero to over 5%. Mortgage rates in the United States rose past 7% for the first time since the year 2000. The housing market slowed sharply. Regional banks that had made loans during the low interest rate period found those loans now worth less in a higher interest rate environment. Silicon Valley Bank in California collapsed in March 2023, becoming the second largest bank failure in United States history, surpassed only by Washington Mutual during the 2008 financial crisis. Signature Bank in New York failed the same weekend. First Republic Bank followed weeks later. The echoes of 2008 were audible to anyone who had been paying careful attention to the pattern. Federal regulators at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation guaranteed deposits beyond the legal insurance limit to prevent a broader bank run from spreading through the American financial system. Each intervention added to the debt. Each guarantee expanded the implied balance sheet of the United States government. Each rescue became the foundation for the next crisis in the cycle. Stage 6 is defined by this compounding dynamic. Solutions become the seeds of future problems. Rescues become the justification for larger risks in the next cycle of economic expansion. The Congressional Budget Office projected in 2024 that the United States national debt would reach $54 trillion by the year 2034 if current spending and taxation levels remained unchanged. Interest payments on the national debt were projected to exceed the entire defense budget of the United States by the mid-2020s, a milestone that had never been reached in American history. Foreign holders of United States Treasury bonds, particularly China and Japan, began quietly reducing their holdings. China sold over $100 billion in United States Treasuries between 2022 and 2024. The dollar remained the global reserve currency, but its share of global foreign exchange reserves fell from over 70% in 2000 to approximately 58% by the early 2020s, according to International Monetary Fund data. Stage 6 is not a crash. It is a slow erosion. It is the financial equivalent of a coastline retreating 1 meter at a time, invisible from week to week, but undeniable across a decade. The 7-stage pattern identified across historical empires follows this exact sequence, and the United States has now moved through the first 6 stages in a documented and traceable progression. Stage 7 is the one historians write about. It is the stage where the accumulated weight of the previous 6 stages produces a moment that forces a fundamental restructuring of the financial order. It happened to Britain in 1956 during the Suez Crisis, when the United States refused to support the British pound and the empire visibly and permanently lost its global financial authority. It happened to the Ottoman Empire in 1881 when foreign creditors established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration in Constantinople and effectively took control of the empire financial decisions from the inside. It happened to Argentina in 2001 when citizens in Buenos Aires stood outside, locked bank doors, and beat on the glass with their hands because their savings had been frozen overnight. It happened to Weimar Germany in the early 1920s when workers in Berlin carried wheelbarrows full of paper currency to buy a single loaf of bread at the local market. None of those nations believed they were approaching stage 7. They believed the strength they had built was permanent. They believed their institutions were too sophisticated to allow a full collapse. History does not care what nations believe about themselves. It only records what they actually did and what the arithmetic of their decisions eventually produced over the long arc of time. The United States has the largest military, the deepest capital markets, and the most innovative economy on Earth. But history shows those qualities delay the pattern. They do not cancel it. The question that historians, economists, and ordinary citizens are now beginning to ask, quietly and with genuine concern, is not whether the pattern exists. The question is, which stage comes next? Stage 7 does not arrive with sirens. It arrives with a spreadsheet, a credit rating agency, and a quiet meeting in a room the public never hears about until it is over. That is the most unsettling truth buried inside every historical collapse. The moment that changes everything is rarely visible until millions of people are already living inside its consequences. To understand what Stage 7 looks like, you have to stand inside the city of Buenos Aires, Argentina, on December 1, 2001, and watch what happened to an entire nation in one weekend. The Argentine government had borrowed heavily through the 1990s, tied its currency to the United States dollar, and told its citizens that the financial system was fundamentally sound and stable. On a Friday evening, the Argentine government announced a bank freeze. Citizens could only withdraw 250 pesos per week from accounts that held their entire life savings inside local bank vaults. By Saturday morning, lines stretched around city blocks in Buenos Aires as families stood outside glass bank doors that would not open, staring at their own money they could no longer touch. Within 2 weeks, Argentina defaulted on $93 billion of sovereign debt, the largest national debt default in recorded world history at that moment in time. 4 presidents resigned in 11 days. The Argentine peso lost 75% of its value against the United States dollar within months of the currency peg being broken apart. Middle-class families in Buenos Aires who had worked their entire adult lives found their savings reduced to a fraction of their purchasing power before they had a chance to act or respond. The historians who studied Argentina did not find chaos at the beginning. They found a pattern. The same pattern that had appeared in 14 other sovereign debt crises across the previous century. Excess borrowing, currency, overvaluation, loss of investor confidence, capital flight, currency collapse, and finally, the restructuring of the entire financial system from the ground up once again. Now stand in a different room. Stand inside the offices of Standard & Poor Rating Agency in New York on August 5, 2011, and watch what happened to the United States credit rating. For the first time in 94 years of recorded United States financial history, Standard & Poor downgraded the credit rating of the United States government from AAA to AA+. The official reason given in the Standard & Poor report was the political dysfunction in Washington, D.C. that had brought the country within hours of defaulting on its own debt obligations. Congress had reached the debt ceiling, the legal limit on how much the government could borrow, and politicians in Washington had turned the routine process of raising that ceiling into a public standoff. Markets around the world watched as elected officials in the United States Capitol building used the full faith and credit of the United States government as a bargaining chip in a political dispute. The downgrade sent shockwaves through global bond markets. Foreign governments that held United States Treasury bonds as their safest and most trusted asset had to recalibrate their risk models overnight. It was not a collapse, but it was a signal, the kind of signal that historians later identify as the moment when the trajectory of a great financial power visibly began to shift. Between 2011 and 2024, the United States faced debt ceiling standoffs in 2013, 2021, 2023, and again in 2025, each time coming closer to the edge of what markets could absorb without panic. Each standoff added to a growing perception among foreign investors that the United States government was increasingly unable to manage its own fiscal situation with the discipline the world expected from it. In May 2023, Fitch Ratings placed the United States on negative credit watch. In August 2023, Fitch downgraded United States sovereign debt from AAA to AA+, the second agency to do so. Two of the three major global credit rating agencies had now removed the highest credit grade from the government of the United States, an event with no precedent in modern financial history. Moody Rating Agency, the third of the three major agencies, placed the United States on negative outlook in 2023 and then delivered a formal downgrade in May 2025, completing the historic triple downgrade. All three major credit rating agencies had now downgraded the United States government within a 14-year period. Historians studying this sequence called it an unprecedented erosion of sovereign credit standing. The implications of that triple downgrade travel far beyond bond markets. They reach into the architecture of global trade, the price of borrowing, and the long-term position of the dollar itself. When a nation loses its AAA credit rating, the interest it must pay to borrow money from global markets increases. Higher borrowing costs mean more of the national budget flows toward interest payments. More money spent on interest means less money available for infrastructure, education, defense, healthcare, and the programs that hold the fabric of a society together across generations of citizens. The United States spent approximately $892 billion on interest payments on its national debt in the fiscal year 2024, more than it spent on the entire United States military budget that year. A nation that spends more on the interest of its past decisions than on the security of its present citizens has entered a fiscal position that every historical empire recognized too late as critical. This is the architecture of Stage 7. It is not a single dramatic event. It is the moment when the compounding weight of all previous stages begins to structurally limit the options of the future. Economists at the Peterson Institute for International Economics published research in 2024, showing that the United States debt-to-gross domestic product ratio had passed 120% and was continuing to climb. Historical analysis shows that nations which sustain debt-to-gross domestic product ratios above 90% for extended periods experience measurably slower economic growth than their historical averages over prior decades. Slower growth means lower tax revenues. Lower tax revenues mean larger deficits. Larger deficits mean more borrowing. More borrowing means higher debt. Higher debt means higher interest. The cycle feeds itself. This self-reinforcing dynamic is what economists call a debt spiral, and it is the precise mechanism that transformed manageable debt burdens into existential financial crises in Portugal, Greece, and Japan in modern history. Greece offers the most instructive modern example. In 2010, Greek government bonds were downgraded to junk status by credit rating agencies after years of hidden deficit. Spending came to light in Athens, the European Central Bank building in Frankfurt, and the International Monetary Fund headquarters. In Washington, D.C., organized emergency loans to prevent Greek financial collapse from spreading to the broader Eurozone economy. In exchange for those loans, Greece accepted austerity conditions. Government workers saw wages cut, pension payments were reduced, public services were scaled back. Athens streets filled with citizens in visible distress. The Greek economy contracted by 25% over 5 years, a contraction comparable in scale to the damage done to the United States economy. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, Greece eventually recovered, but only after a decade of measurable economic pain that restructured the lives of millions of citizens, who had done nothing wrong except live inside the wrong fiscal trajectory. The United States is not Greece. Its economy is 70 times larger. Its currency is the global reserve currency, and its capital markets are the deepest and most liquid on the planet. But size does not exempt a nation from arithmetic, and the arithmetic of the United States fiscal position in 2025 is producing numbers that serious economists are describing with language they rarely use in public. The International Monetary Fund issued a formal warning in April 2024, calling the United States fiscal trajectory a growing risk not just to the American economy, but to the stability of the global financial system. The Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, the institution that serves as the central bank for central banks worldwide, described advanced economy debt levels as historically unprecedented outside of wartime conditions. These are not fringe voices. These are the institutions that sit at the center of global financial governance, and they are now using language about the United States that was previously reserved for developing nations. Stage 7 is also defined by a shift in the behavior of the nations that have historically trusted and supported the financial leadership of the country at the center of the global system. China held approximately $1.3 trillion in United States Treasury bonds at the peak of its holdings in 2013. By early 2024, that figure had dropped to approximately $775 billion and was still falling. Japan, the largest single foreign holder of United States Treasury bonds, began discussions in 2024 about reducing its exposure as domestic interest rates in Japan began to rise for the first time in decades. Saudi Arabia, whose petrodollar agreement with the United States government had anchored global oil trade in American dollars since 1974, began signing oil trade agreements denominated in Chinese yuan with several Asian nations. The petrodollar system, established in the aftermath of the Nixon Shock and the oil embargo of 1973, had been one of the foundational pillars of dollar dominance for over 50 consecutive years of global trade. When oil, the most traded commodity in the world, begins moving through currencies other than the dollar, the structural demand for dollars in global markets begins a slow but measurable process of reduction. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, held a summit in Johannesburg in 2023 and formally discussed the creation of an alternative reserve currency to reduce dependence on the United States dollar. 6 additional nations, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Argentina, were invited to join the expanded BRICS framework in a move that drew immediate attention from financial analysts worldwide. None of this means the dollar collapses tomorrow. None of this means the United States faces the immediate fate of Argentina or Greece. But it means the architecture is changing around the dollar in real time. History shows that reserve currency transitions are slow, then sudden. The British pound lost its reserve currency status gradually through the 1930s and 1940s, and then visibly and permanently in the Suez Crisis of 1956. British citizens in London did not wake up one morning to find the pound worthless. They watched over decades as the purchasing power, the global influence, and the trust in British financial institutions slowly and steadily faded. The generation that lived through the peak of British financial power never believed they would see its end. The generation that lived through its end had been told by their parents it could never happen. That gap between expectation and reality, between the story a nation tells about itself and the arithmetic underneath that story, is precisely where Stage 7 lives and breathes in historical record after historical record. There is one more dimension of Stage 7 that history reveals consistently, and it is perhaps the most difficult for citizens living inside a powerful nation to fully accept or emotionally process. Every nation that entered Stage 7 did so while its popular culture was still celebrating prosperity. Its stock markets were still posting record highs, and its leaders were still projecting confidence on television screens. The Dow Jones Industrial Average set record highs in 1929 before the Great Depression. Japanese stock markets set record highs in 1989 before a 3-decade period of economic stagnation began across Japan. United States stock markets set record highs in 2024, even as national debt crossed $35 trillion. Credit ratings fell, and foreign holders quietly reduced their treasury bond positions in global markets. Record stock market highs and structural financial vulnerability are not opposites. History shows they can and do exist simultaneously, often right up to the moment that the underlying pressure becomes impossible to ignore. The 7-stage pattern does not predict a specific date. It does not identify a precise trigger. What it does is reveal the structural conditions that make a nation increasingly vulnerable to a disruptive financial event. Those structural conditions, high debt, declining credit ratings, currency competition, rising interest costs, political dysfunction around fiscal decisions, and reduced foreign trust, are now documented facts in the United States financial record. The question that historians ask when they look back at civilizations that move through all 7 stages is never, why did it happen? The question is always, why did no one act when the signs were clear? The answer is always the same. The people who saw the signs clearly had no political incentive to say so loudly. The people with the political incentive had no reason to disrupt a system that was still working for them. Citizens in the Weimar Republic saw inflation rising in 1921 and believed their government would correct it. By 1923, a single United States dollar could buy 4.2 trillion German marks on the open market. Citizens in Zimbabwe watched inflation climb through the 1990s and believed the government of President Robert Mugabe would stabilize the currency before it reached a point of genuine social collapse and breakdown. By 2008, Zimbabwe had issued a $100 trillion banknote, a physical object now displayed in museums around the world as a monument to what happens when fiscal discipline is abandoned completely and permanently. These are extreme examples. The United States is not Weimar Germany and is not Zimbabwe. But the mechanism, the human tendency to believe that correction will come before crisis, is identical across all of these cases. What separates nations that navigate Stage 7 successfully from those that do not is rarely intelligence or resources. It is almost always the willingness to accept short-term pain in exchange for long-term structural stability. Canada faced a severe fiscal crisis in the mid-1990s with a debt-to-gross domestic product ratio approaching 70% and international bond markets beginning to question the creditworthiness of Canadian government debt. The Canadian government in Ottawa made a series of painful spending decisions, cutting departmental budgets, restructuring social programs, and reducing the deficit over a sustained period of fiscal discipline across multiple years. By the early 2000s, Canada had returned to budget surplus, reduced its debt burden, and rebuilt international confidence in its fiscal management, becoming one of the few developed nations to emerge from a debt spiral cleanly. Canada succeeded because its political system produced the consensus needed to accept short-term sacrifice. That consensus is the rarest and most valuable resource in any nation facing a Stage 6 or Stage 7 transition. The United States Congress has not passed a formal federal budget on time in 27 of the last 47 fiscal years, operating instead through a series of continuing resolutions that defer rather than resolve fiscal decisions. Political gridlock in Washington, D.C. has made the kind of sustained fiscal discipline that Canada demonstrated in the 1990s structurally difficult to achieve within the current framework of American political institutions and incentives. That is not a partisan statement. It is a structural observation that appears consistently in the academic literature on fiscal governance produced by institutions from the Peterson Institute to the Brookings Institution to the International Monetary Fund. The path forward for the United States is not predetermined. History shows that nations with deep institutional strength, large economies, and reserve currency status have more tools available than smaller nations facing similar pressures. The Federal Reserve, the United States Treasury, the depth of American capital markets, and the innovation capacity of the American economy represent real and substantial buffers that have no equivalent in the historical examples studied. But buffers are not solutions. They are time. And the question of what the United States does with the time those buffers provide is the central financial question of the next decade of American history. Every person who understands this 7-stage pattern looks at their own financial life differently, not with fear, with clarity, because clarity is the only thing that turns historical knowledge into personal and collective agency. The families who understood what was happening in Argentina in 2001 moved their savings before the bank freeze. The investors who studied Japan in 1989 avoided a market that took 34 years to recover. Understanding a historical pattern does not guarantee safety, but it provides something more valuable than any single financial product or market prediction. It provides a framework for reading what is actually happening around you. We began this story with a simple observation. The United States has the largest economy on Earth, and yet the signs of a slow financial unraveling have appeared before in nations that once said the same thing. That observation is not a prediction of doom, it is an invitation to pay attention. Because the nations that paid attention early had choices. The nations that ignored the pattern had only consequences waiting for them. The 7-stage wealth collapse is not a theory invented by pessimists. It is a pattern documented by economic historians across centuries of recorded financial behavior in empires, republics, and modern democratic states alike. The fact that it has appeared in every major financial collapse in recorded history is not a coincidence. It is a structural truth about how human institutions respond to the slow accumulation of financial pressure over time. History does not repeat exactly, but it does rhyme with remarkable consistency across cultures, continents, and centuries of human financial decision-making at the national and imperial level across the full arc of recorded time. The past still has stories to tell. Subscribe and let us uncover them together.